Let's talk about the latest developments in the United States, where the climate policy had a huge step forward with the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is called one of the most important laws in the United States history. As we have seen from the history of climate negotiations, for quite a few years there was an impression that America wanted only to pay lip service to the climate problem, completely losing its credibility in the absence of climate action. We have seen anything from the impressive speeches from President Obama, not always substantiated by action.
Our planet has been wounded by our actions. Those wounds won't be healed today or tomorrow or the next, but they can be healed by degrees. And if we start with that spirit, if each of us can fight through the occasional frustration and dread, if we pledge to do our part and then follow through on those commitments, I believe we can secure a better future.
To the straightforward global warming denial from President Trump.
We want to work with you to really recognize the changing climate and what it means to our forests, and actually work together with that science. That science is going to be key, because if we ignore that science and sort of put our head in the sand and think it's all about vegetation management, we're not going to succeed together protecting Californians.
Okay, it'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Hey, well, I don't think science knows, actually.
Donald Trump famously withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, and his administration rolled back nearly 100 environmental rules during his presidency, eliminating important regulations for the fossil fuel industry. However, on the Earth Day, during the Leaders' Summit on Climate in April 2021, the Biden-Harris administration announced a new target for the United States to achieve at least 50% reduction in economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This has become a new nationally determined contribution commitment of the United States under the Paris Agreement.
The science is undeniable, but the cost of inaction keeps mounting. The United States isn't waiting. We are resolving to take action. The countries that take decisive action now to create the industries of the future will be the ones that reap the economic benefits of the clean energy boom that's coming.
For years, US Congress has repeatedly failed to pass a bill aimed explicitly at reducing carbon pollution, and a lot of executive action through regulations has met resistance in the courts. So for many, the Inflation Reduction Act came as a surprise, especially given that there has been complete absence of support of climate agenda by the Republicans. It was signed into law by President Joe Biden on August 16, 2022. So how did this regulation come about? Initially, the administration of Joe Biden proposed a legislative framework called Build Back Better. It was a large-scale and ambitious proposal suggesting the largest nationwide investment in social, infrastructural, and environmental programs since 1930s Great Depression era. As negotiations progressed, and in order to get sufficient political support, a huge part of this plan had to be reworked and reduced in size, scope, and cost. Eventually, the Inflation Reduction Act, covering climate change, healthcare, and tax reforms, has become a law, and it catapulted the United States into the position of global leaders in climate change policy. It also created a lot of anxiety among European countries worried about losing their competitiveness. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So what's covered in this regulation? The name of the Inflation Reduction Act is certainly a bit confusing, because many analysts believe that its impact on climate is arguably bigger than its potential impact on inflation. This bill provides $369 billion in funding for climate and clean energy. And according to analysts, it could cut national greenhouse gas emissions up to 40% by 2030 compared to 2003 levels, which might put the United States within reach of its nationally determined contribution commitment under the Paris Agreement. The bill provisions are expected to spur an economic boom, boosting GDP by nearly 1% in 2030. In the words of the White House's Inflation Reduction Act guidebook, these investments will lower energy costs for families and small businesses, accelerate private investment in clean energy solutions in every sector of the economy and every corner of the country, strengthen supply chains for everything from critical minerals to efficient electrical appliances, and create good-paying jobs and new economic opportunities for workers. The bill's emission reduction provisions include clean energy and electric vehicle tax credits, large-scale investments in domestic clean tech manufacturing, and environmental justice measures. The bill also aims to strengthen its position in a global competition with China and created a new national industrial policy designed to reshore certain clean energy industries and nurture US competitors to Chinese electric vehicle companies. While many are still digesting all of the provisions of this regulation, it is clear that the scale of incentives is far-reaching, providing tax credits and funding for the growth in clean energy manufacturing, wind and solar power generation. It drives innovation through research and development of clean technology and low-carbon materials. It creates demand for low-carbon products in construction of buildings and transportation projects. It also gives incentives to Americans to buy new and second-hand electric cars and to install heat pumps to warm their homes. So the bill is both rewarding domestic manufacturing and production, and at the same time it stimulates demand for cleaner products, including electric vehicles, low-carbon materials, and clean technologies. Let's have a look at some of the highlights of the bill. The bill includes over $60 billion to onshore clean energy manufacturing in the United States across the full supply chain of clean energy and transportation technologies. These manufacturing incentives aim to reduce supply chain dependencies and bring down the cost of clean energy and clean vehicles. The bill provides a range of incentives to consumers to buy energy-efficient electric appliances, clean vehicles, and rooftop solar, and invest in home energy efficiency, with a significant portion of the funding going to lower-income households and disadvantaged communities. This should help to relieve the high costs of energy and decrease utility bills. This bill also aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in every sector of the economy, substantially reduce emissions from electricity production, transportation, industrial manufacturing, buildings, and agriculture. The bill also includes $60 billion in environmental justice priorities to drive investments into disadvantaged communities. And finally, the bill highlights the role of the rural communities in addressing climate change, investing in climate-smart agriculture, forest restoration, and land conservation. It also makes significant investments in clean energy development in rural communities. Here's a short extract from Bloomberg Green video exploring Inflation Reduction Act.
I mean, this law is just absolutely massive. It contains some, $369 billion that has been earmarked for energy and environmental initiatives. And, you just can't overstate really the breadth of its support for clean and advanced energy. Some of the highlights include, a $27 billion program to basically launch a national green bank and fund regional green banks. The idea there is that this $27 billion is essentially seed money. This bank will lure even more private sector capital and really really act as kind of an incubator for clean energy projects across the U.S., including those that are really hard to commercialize. The legislation also, expands and reforms and creates new 10-year tax incentives for all sorts of clean energy ventures. I mean, we're talking about hydrogen as well as solar and wind power, carbon capture systems, and nuclear plants. So there's a tremendous amount of tax incentives in here to support clean energy. There's also spending for the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which has been really critical in advancing new technologies. And I can tell you that the folks at the Energy Department are itching to go with that. Really, there's just so much spending and so many impactful provisions layered across this bill. One sleeper item is language in the bill and language in the law, really, that will bolster the EPA's ability to strongly regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a combination of spending and new programs and tax credits, as well as actual language that will help regulate the greenhouse gas emissions driving climate change.
So you can see that the Inflation Reduction Act is praised for unprecedented support of the clean energy, boosting domestic manufacturing and innovation, creating jobs, aiming to cut emissions from power and transport sectors, and addressing pollution. However, it is also criticized for some of the provisions which are so-called compromises that were necessary to get the bill approved. The bill includes tax credits for carbon capture and storage, which could extend the life of the dirty coal plants. And it also mandates the federal government to offer up parts of the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska for oil and gas development. It is interesting to note that the way the United States choose to address climate change is almost entirely through incentives and economic growth. In this way, the Inflation Reduction Act resembles China's approach to climate policy, which tries to decarbonize by making strategic investments in certain industries and not by regulating or taxing carbon emissions. We have talked earlier about various tools which the governments have in their disposal to facilitate the decarbonization of the economy. And you can see that this document almost entirely avoids any fines, carbon taxes, or other punitive measures, except for the methane fee, which really stands out as the only tax or fee charged for emissions in this legislation. This methane fee is imposed on the excess of methane emissions from designated petroleum and natural gas facilities beginning 1st of January 2024. However, critics note that the fee will affect only a small number of companies and independent producers, as it only applies to companies that emit 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And also some companies will not fall under this methane fee if they comply with the upcoming Environmental Protection Agency's methane rules, which require companies to upgrade equipment, monitor leaks, and clean them up. The bill also includes a number of other exemptions, such as distribution facilities that bring natural gas to homes and businesses, and some pipelines and gathering facilities that sell volumes of gas below a certain threshold. So it might not be as effective as some people think. Nevertheless, despite all the compromises and criticism of the bill, if we look at the overall direction of the bill and the requirements that it includes, it is essentially driving the country towards a lower carbon economy. This bill contains an enormous amount of information, and if you want to look into more details, you can either read the bill or I have put together a list of documents which provide helpful summaries. And I will provide the links in the notes to this lecture. One is the White House's guidebook on the Inflation Reduction Act's investments in clean energy and climate action. The other one, also a great summary from the Bipartisan Policy Center. And the third one, which I recommend, is by Congressional Research Service. One very important aspect of the Inflation Reduction Act is that it incentivizes companies to use and produce components and equipment within the US domestic supply chain, and in some cases to source only from the United States or from countries with whom the United States has a free trade agreement. For example, if you look at the electric vehicles, US consumers can earn tax breaks of $7,500, but only if the vehicle final assembly is in the North America, where at least half of the value of the vehicle battery components are also manufactured in the United States. Some of other subsidies, such as aggressive solar manufacturing and hydrogen incentives, are available only to American firms. This means that a lot of international businesses are seriously concerned about their competitiveness under the new regulations. And some manufacturers are even discussing opening new or moving their existing facilities to the United States in order to benefit from the bill's provisions. South Korea is concerned that its car makers will not be eligible for US tax breaks, and the European Union have accused the United States of potentially breaching the World Trade Organization's principle of non-discrimination, that one's own and foreign products should be treated alike. And we are already seeing announcements from large corporates about reducing their workforce in Europe and moving jobs to the United States. For example, in February 2023, Ford announced that they will cut almost 4,000 jobs in Europe, mostly in Germany and the UK. While some of the cuts are related to the internal restructuring aimed to increase the manufacturing and sales of electric vehicles, they aim to have EVs to be 1/3 of all global sales by 2026. But the creation of 2,500 jobs in battery manufacturing in the US is definitely driven by the Inflation Reduction Act, as the company hopes to produce one of the lowest cost American-made batteries when the plant comes online. Many commentators say that the bill could spark the bidding war on subsidies, and already sparked EU policy response. Here's, for example, the EU Commission President commenting on the US and China push with their own industrial subsidies for clean tech.
The United States are our friends and our partners, very clear. And it's very good that we are all now investing heavily in the green transition. Important is, if we look at green tech, the tech industry, that we have a level playing field. I think we should compete on content, on quality, but not on subsidies. And if such subsidies are necessary to boost the development of the clean tech industry, then we should do it as a joint effort, which we are just working on as European Union with our American friends.
And so does that leave China as the main competitor in this area?
Indeed, we want to work with China on fighting climate change, but it needs to be a work where fairness and a level playing field is provided. And we see that China is massively subsidizing, in a hidden way, its industries, while it is not giving access to the market to European companies, and that can't be, that is not acceptable. So competition is good, trade is good, but it has to be fair and a level playing field.
In February 2023, the European Commission proposed the Green Deal Industrial Plan, with the objective to enhance the competitiveness of Europe's net zero industry. The plan has 4 pillars. The first one is about simplifying regulatory framework. The Commission will develop a Net Zero Industry Act to provide a regulatory framework suited for the quick development of net zero industrial capacity, as well as Critical Raw Materials Act to ensure sufficient access to those materials, like rare earths that are vital for manufacturing key technologies. This will be complemented by the reform of the electricity market design to make consumers benefit from the lower costs of renewables. The second pillar of the plan looks at the number of measures that will speed up investment and financing for clean tech production in Europe, including relaxation of the existing EU state aid rules. This might include amendments to the temporary state aid crisis and transition framework and the general block exemption regulation, making it easier to support green investments. Plus, the Commission will facilitate the use of existing EU funds for financing clean tech innovation, manufacturing and deployment, focusing on Repower EU, Invest EU, the Innovation Fund and proposed earlier European Sovereignty Fund. The third pillar is about skills, where Commission will propose to establish industry academies to roll out upskilling and reskilling programs in strategic industries. And this will be combined with measures to facilitate access to third country nationals to EU labour markets in priority sectors, and to foster and align private funding for skills development. The fourth and final pillar is about global cooperation and making trade work for the green transition under the principles of fair competition and open trade, building on the engagements with the EU partners and the work of the World Trade Organization. That covers the EU's network of free trade agreements and other forms of cooperation, including creation of critical raw materials club and clean tech net zero industrial partnerships. So overall, the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan aims to boost clean tech manufacturing in Europe and provide simplified regulatory framework for production capacity of technologies which are considered vital to meet Europe's climate neutrality goals. So which technologies will be covered? The Commission lists a number of them, including batteries, windmills, heat pumps, solar, electrolyzers, and carbon capture and storage. So all of them will be targeted by the forthcoming act. However, they say that the list is not final, and many critics say that the announcement has been vague and lacking details. So as soon as we get more details on this plan, I will update this lecture with new information. Here in the UK, where post-Brexit, the government could come up with their independent response to the Inflation Reduction Act. So far, we have seen only announcement by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak about creation of dedicated department for energy security and net zero, as well as Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. So these were created after splitting up the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And we're still to see the results of the work of these new departments. In conclusion, I would like to say that the Inflation Reduction Act has fundamentally changed the terms of the debate on clean energy funding and supply chains in the US and in Europe. In a world where China, the EU and the US are all subsidizing domestic production, there might be the pressure for other countries to do the same. But at the moment it looks that neither UK or Europe currently can match the level of grants, tax breaks and subsidies which the Inflation Reduction Act offers. We can also expect that there will be more free trade agreements between the United States and countries which currently don't have such agreements. And that means that some of these US climate policy provisions might come into policy of these countries which will sign such agreements with the United States. Some commentators even think that the Inflation Reduction Act might help speed up a green vortex that lowers the cost of wind, solar, batteries and other crucial technologies. In the past decade, it was China and Europe who helped driving the tenfold decline in solar prices and helped fuel the explosive growth of solar power around the world. So now the United States will have further impact, and these lower costs will benefit developing countries and make them more likely to utilize clean energy rather than fossil fuels to power their growing economies. So we will be watching the developments and will report in the next update of this course. Thank you for watching. So this was an update to the course on the history of climate negotiations and the role of policymakers in decarbonization of the economy.